T-sequence narratives has always been a space where small moments are allowed to exist without interruption. Today's moment begins with something simple, a message that was never sent. There was a time when reaching out happened almost without thought. The movement was small, a phone lifted from a table, a sentence typed while waiting for something else. It felt natural, almost automatic. If something happened during the day, a strange moment at work, a passing thought, a small frustration, the instinct was immediate. A message would appear on the screen, sometimes long, sometimes just a line, but always sent. The habit had formed slowly over time, the way many habits do between people who speak often enough that conversation becomes part of the background of life. It wasn't effort, it was simply the rhythm things had always followed. Days moved forward with that quiet routine. Morning conversations, occasional messages during the afternoon, longer exchanges when the evening settled in and the world outside slowed down. The phone would light up again and again, each message extending the conversation just a little further. Nothing dramatic ever happened inside those conversations, just fragments of ordinary life. But over time, those fragments began forming something steady, something familiar. And familiarity has a way of making itself invisible. It becomes part of the structure of a day, so common that it disappears into the background. The change did not arrive all at once. It appeared in places that were easy to ignore. A message that used to arrive quickly now took longer. An evening conversation ended sooner than usual. A question received a short answer instead of a long one. Each moment felt small enough to dismiss. People become busy, schedules shift, days fill with other things. At first, the explanation felt simple, and simple explanations make it easy to continue as if nothing has changed. So the habit continued. If something happened during the day, a message still appeared. Sometimes the reply came hours later, sometimes the reply was only a few words, but it still came, and that was enough to keep the rhythm moving forward. Weeks passed that way, then months. The pattern grew slowly, quietly, easy to overlook if you weren't looking closely. Occasionally, there were moments when the old rhythm returned. A conversation would stretch a little longer, messages would arrive quickly again. For a short time, the familiar pace reappeared. Those moments felt reassuring, proof that the connection still existed somewhere underneath the quieter exchanges. But the moments never lasted long. The longer conversations faded again, and slowly the pattern returned to its quieter shape. Messages arriving later, conversations ending sooner. A rhythm that had once felt effortless now carried something slightly heavier. Not difficult, just noticeable. One evening, the awareness appeared in a different way. The phone rested on the table. A message had already been written. Something small about the day, nothing important, just another continuation of the same conversation that had existed for years. The sentence waited on the screen, but before sending it, the hand paused. Not for long, just a moment, a small interruption in a motion that had always happened automatically. The pause felt unfamiliar, because the thought behind it had never appeared before. What would happen if the message wasn't sent? The idea arrived quietly, almost by accident. Reaching out had never felt like a decision before. It had simply been the way the day moved forward. But now it felt like a choice, and choices introduce questions, questions that weren't there before. The phone remained in the same place on the table, the message still waiting on the screen. For a moment longer, the sentence stayed there. Then the screen went dark. The message disappeared. Nothing had been sent. The decision was small, barely noticeable, just a quiet change in the direction the day had taken. There was no announcement, no explanation. The conversation window simply closed, and the waiting began. At first, the waiting felt unusual. The phone stayed quiet longer than expected. Every so often, the screen was checked, not intentionally, just the way people sometimes check things out of habit. But each time the screen appeared, nothing new was there. The quiet stretched forward. Hours passed. The next day arrived. The phone remained still, not silent in a dramatic way, just quiet, like a room where something familiar had been removed. The absence wasn't painful, but it was noticeable. The days continued moving forward. Work filled the mornings, errands filled the afternoons. Evenings arrived the same way they always had. But a small part of the routine had shifted. A message that might once have appeared during the day no longer did. The rhythm of conversation had paused, and the pause continued. Several days passed before the thought returned again, the same question that had appeared earlier. What would happen if the message wasn't sent? Not for permanently, just for a while, just long enough to see whether the silence would remain. The waiting continued. One day, then another. The quiet stretched forward in a way that slowly became easier to notice. No new messages appeared, no casual questions, no check-ins, nothing that would restart the conversation. At first, the silence was easy to explain. Schedules become busy, unexpected things happen, people sometimes disappear into their own days. Those explanations remained possible, but as the days moved forward, they began to feel less certain. Not wrong, just incomplete, because silence has its own way of revealing patterns that are difficult to see when conversation never stops. A week passed. The quiet remained exactly the same. That was when another possibility appeared, a quiet one, almost hesitant. What if the conversations had only continued because someone kept beginning them? What if the rhythm had always depended on one small action repeating again and again? The idea lingered, not as a conclusion, just as a possibility. Around that time, the season began to change. The evenings felt cooler, leaves gathered along the edges of sidewalks. The air carried the quiet signals of autumn arriving slowly. One night, the window remained open while the street outside settled into its familiar calm. A few cars passed, distant lights appeared in apartment windows across the street. The city continued its quiet movement, and inside the room, the phone rested on the table, face down, still. It had once been the center of countless small interactions. Stories exchanged, jokes shared, fragments of daily life moving back and forth between two people who had once spoken often enough that conversation never needed to be planned. Now it looked almost unfamiliar, not because the device itself had changed, but because its place in the routine had shifted. For the first time, it became clear how much of the connection had existed inside that small object, and how easily the motion could stop when neither person reached for it. The silence eventually became easier to carry, not because it disappeared, but because it began to make sense. Relationships rarely end through a single moment. More often, they change through something quieter, through the slow accumulation of missed conversations, unanswered questions, plans that remain only ideas. The realization formed gradually. No anger arrived with it, no blame, just a clearer understanding of something that had been difficult to see before. Reaching out had always felt natural, but perhaps the balance had never been perfectly even. Perhaps the rhythm had always depended on a quiet effort that went mostly unnoticed. And noticing something late does not mean it appeared late. Sometimes it had been there from the beginning. A few weeks later, a message finally appeared. Short, casual, the kind of message that might once have restarted the familiar rhythm. The screen lit up. The notification appeared. For a moment, everything looked the same as it had months earlier, but something inside had already shifted. The message received a reply. Calm, polite. The conversation continued briefly. Then it ended again. This time, when the silence returned, there was no urge to restart it. Not because the connection had lost meaning, but because the shape of the connection had become clearer. Some conversations move forward through two people reaching toward each other, and when that motion slows, the quiet between them begins to speak in its own way. The silence that follows rarely announces itself. It simply settles into place, like distance arriving slowly, barely noticeable at first, until one day it is already there. Some connections drift quietly once the reaching stops. If a moment like this stayed with you, a quiet like or a comment sometimes appears without much intention. You've been listening to T-Sequence Narratives. Some moments don't end, they just stop being spoken about.